Part 1. The warning nobody wants to hear. Right now, there is a shift happening in the financial world that most people will only understand after it is too late. My name is Zara, and I want you to listen carefully, because what we are about to discuss is not about predictions or panic. It is about recognizing a pattern that has repeated throughout history and understanding what it means for your future. The phrase dollar collapse trade sounds dramatic. It sounds like something extreme, something distant, something that does not apply to everyday life. But the truth is much simpler and far more important. It is about one idea. What happens when the system you trust to protect your wealth slowly stops doing that? There was a time in my life when I believed that saving money was enough. I believed that discipline alone would secure my future. I worked consistently, avoided unnecessary risks, and kept my savings in what I thought was the safest place possible. And for a while, everything seemed fine. But over time, something began to feel off. The numbers in my account were increasing, but my financial confidence was not. The cost of basic living kept rising. Things that used to feel affordable started requiring more thought. It was subtle at first, almost easy to ignore, but eventually it became impossible to dismiss. I realized that I was not building wealth. I was maintaining an illusion of progress while the real value of my money was slowly decreasing. That realization changes the way you see everything, because it forces you to ask a question that most people avoid. What if the system itself is not designed to preserve your wealth? Not because it is broken, but because it was never built for that purpose in the first place. Money, especially modern currency, is not a static store of value. It is a tool. It is managed, expanded, and adjusted based on economic needs. And those needs do not always align with the long-term interests of savers. This is where the idea behind the dollar collapse trade begins. It is not about betting against a country. It is not about expecting chaos tomorrow. It is about understanding that when a currency is continuously expanded, its purchasing power naturally declines over time. This is not an opinion. It is a structural reality. And the most important part is this. This process does not feel like a collapse while it is happening. It feels normal. Prices rise gradually. Adjustments happen slowly. Life continues. And because there is no sudden shock, most people never respond. They adapt instead of preparing. They accept instead of questioning. And that is exactly why this matters. Because by the time it becomes obvious to everyone, the opportunity to act calmly has already passed. The title of this video uses the phrase, last chance, and that phrase needs to be understood correctly. It does not mean that everything changes tomorrow. It means that the window for slow, thoughtful preparation does not stay open forever. There comes a point where the shift becomes visible to everyone, and when that happens, decisions are no longer made with clarity. They are made under pressure. And decisions made under pressure are rarely good ones. So the real question is not whether the system will change. The real question is whether you will recognize the change early enough to position yourself intelligently. Because wealth is not just about how much money you have. It is about how well that money holds its value over time. And if the value of money itself is changing, then the strategy for protecting it must change as well. This is where most people hesitate. Not because they are incapable of understanding, but because accepting this reality requires a shift in mindset. It requires you to move from passive saving to active thinking. It requires you to question assumptions that have been repeated for decades. And most importantly, it requires you to take responsibility for your financial future in a way that most people never do. Because at the end of the day, no system is responsible for protecting your wealth. That responsibility belongs to you. And once you truly understand that, you cannot go back to thinking the same way again. In the next part, we are going to go deeper into what a collapse actually looks like in the real world, and why it is already happening in a way most people fail to notice. अगर आप अगला part चाहते हैं, तो yes लिखें. Part 2. The collapse you don't see. When most people hear the word collapse, they imagine something sudden. They imagine a moment where everything breaks at once. But real financial collapse rarely works like that. It is not loud. It is not instant. It is not obvious. It is slow. It happens quietly, through a steady decline in purchasing power. Your money does not disappear. It just becomes weaker. And this is where most people get confused, because if the number in your bank account is increasing, it feels like progress. But if the cost of everything around you is rising faster than that number, then in reality, you are moving backwards. This is the kind of collapse that affects millions of people without creating panic. It does not force action. It encourages complacency. And that is what makes it dangerous. Now let us take this one step further. Modern currencies are not backed by physical assets like they once were. They are backed by trust. Trust in institutions. Trust in stability. Trust in long-term strength. As long as that trust remains strong, the system functions smoothly. But trust is not permanent. It changes based on economic conditions, policy decisions, and global dynamics. And over time, small shifts in trust can lead to large shifts in value. This is why the global financial landscape matters. Because today, we are seeing subtle but important changes. Countries are slowly reducing reliance on a single currency. Trade systems are becoming more flexible. Economic power is becoming more distributed. None of this causes immediate disruption, but it changes the foundation. And when the foundation changes, everything built on top of it eventually adjusts. At the same time, debt continues to expand, and this is a critical piece of the puzzle, because debt requires servicing, and servicing large amounts of debt often leads to one solution: more money creation. This is not a failure of the system. It is how the system survives. But survival comes with a cost, and that cost is the gradual weakening of currency value. This is the environment we are living in today. Not a sudden collapse, but a slow shift. Not chaos, but erosion. And once you understand this, the idea of the dollar collapse trade starts to make more sense. It is not about predicting disaster. It is about responding to a trend that is already in motion. In the next part, we will explore how thoughtful investors respond to this kind of environment and what it means to position yourself in a way that protects your future without relying on a single system. अगर आप अगला पार्ट चाहते हैं तो yes लिखें. Part 3. Thinking like a long-term investor. Once you understand that the value of money can change over time, the next step is simple. You stop thinking only in terms of saving, and you start thinking in terms of positioning. This is where many people struggle, because they are taught to focus on stability, not adaptability. But in a changing system, adaptability is what creates long-term security. The idea behind the dollar collapse trade is not extreme. It is actually one of the oldest principles in investing. Do not depend entirely on a single system. Instead, spread your exposure across different forms of value. This is what true diversification looks like. Not just owning different assets, but owning assets that respond differently to change. Some assets are directly tied to currency strength. Others exist independently of it, and understanding that difference is critical. For example, Certain physical assets have maintained value across generations, not because they grow quickly, but because they are limited and widely accepted. They do not depend on policy decisions. They exist outside of the system. Then there are assets connected to the real economy, things that people need regardless of financial conditions. These types of assets often behave differently when currency weakens. They can adjust in value because they are tied to real demand. There is also value in geographic diversity. The world economy is not controlled by a single region. Different areas grow at different rates. Different currencies respond to different pressures. By having exposure beyond one system, you reduce the impact of any single shift. But this is where discipline becomes important. Because diversification is not about reacting quickly, it is about building slowly. It is about making consistent, thoughtful decisions over time. And this is where most people fail. Not because they do not understand the idea, but because they do not apply it with patience. They want immediate results. They want certainty. But real investing does not work that way. It requires acceptance of uncertainty. It requires long-term thinking. And most importantly, it requires emotional control. Because the biggest threat to any strategy is not the market. It is your reaction to it. In the next part, we are going to talk about those reactions, the mistakes that turn good strategies into bad outcomes, and why understanding them is just as important as understanding the opportunity itself. अगर आप अगला पार्ट चाहते हैं, तो yes लिखें. Part 4. The mistakes that destroy wealth. Information alone does not protect you. Execution does. And this is where most people make critical mistakes. The first mistake is acting out of fear. They hear about currency decline, economic shifts, or financial instability, and they respond emotionally. They make sudden decisions. They move too quickly. And in doing so, they often create more risk instead of reducing it. The second mistake is overconfidence. Some people believe they have found the perfect solution. They concentrate everything into one idea, one asset, one strategy. But concentration increases vulnerability, because if that one idea fails, everything is affected. The third mistake is ignoring the foundation. Investing without a stable financial base is dangerous. If you have high debt, no emergency reserves, or unstable income, then even the best strategy becomes fragile. The foundation must come first. Without it, nothing else holds. The fourth mistake is chasing momentum. When something starts rising in value, people rush in, not because they understand it, but because they do not want to miss out. This is where poor timing happens, and poor timing leads to losses. The final and most damaging mistake is inaction. Doing nothing, waiting too long, hoping that things will stay the same. Because change feels uncomfortable. But avoiding discomfort does not stop change from happening. It only delays your response to it. And delayed responses are often expensive. This is why awareness must lead to action. Not extreme action, not rushed action, but deliberate action. Because the goal is not to react to every shift. The goal is to build a structure that can handle change over time. In the final part, we will bring everything together. We will talk about what this means for you, what you should take away from this conversation, and why the idea of last chance is not about fear, but about timing. अगर आप अगला पार्ट चाहते हैं, तो yes लिखें. Part 5. The final warning and your decision. At this point, you understand the situation. You understand that currency value is not fixed. You understand that the system is evolving. And you understand that relying entirely on one structure carries risk. Now comes the most important part: what you choose to do with that understanding. Because knowledge without action changes nothing, and action without thought creates new problems. The balance is what matters. No one can tell you exactly what will happen next. No one can give you a perfect timeline. And anyone who claims certainty in an uncertain system should be approached carefully. But there are things we do know. We know that purchasing power declines over time in expanding monetary systems. We know that diversification reduces dependency. We know that long-term thinking outperforms short-term reaction. And we know that preparation is always easier before pressure arrives. This is where the idea of last chance becomes clear. It is not about urgency for the sake of fear. It is about recognizing that timing matters. Right now, there is still space to think clearly, to act calmly, to position yourself without pressure. But that will not always be the case. Because once a shift becomes obvious to everyone, behavior changes. Markets move faster, decisions become emotional, and opportunities become limited. That is when people wish they had acted earlier, not because they missed a prediction, but because they ignored a pattern. So here's the final thought. Wealth is not about chasing outcomes. It is about preparing for possibilities. It is about building a structure that can survive uncertainty. And most importantly, it is about taking responsibility for your financial future before circumstances force you to. Because in the end, the system will continue to change. That is inevitable. But whether those changes work for you or against you depends entirely on what you do before they arrive.